He spent the first half of his life running from that barren stretch of land, only to be forced, by his mother's final act, to bend his back and return. When the $8 million Victorian manor was announced, no one spared a second glance at the derelict farm in the corner of the will, worth barely $127,000. Everyone assumed it was the old woman's final slight against her wayward son, a public humiliation dressed up as inheritance. But he knew better. He had missed his daughter's entire childhood, failed to show up for his mother's funeral, and spent 10 years too afraid to make a single phone call. He thought escaping the farm meant escaping its curse. Then he found the iron box buried in the silt of a forgotten irrigation ditch, 37 notebooks, each one filled with his mother's handwriting. They held her loneliness, his birthday reminders, and one line, scrawled on the last page in a trembling hand. "Jamie, the key is under the doormat." When he finally knelt down and began to dig out the stone channel that had been choked with earth for 70 years, he uncovered his great-grandfather's inscription on the foundation slab. "Mortar can turn the millstone, and it can also turn the heart." But could a handful of soil and an old granite grindstone really bridge a chasm that had grown for half a lifetime? Could the daughter, who had watched her mother wither from neglect and who now owned a fortune in marble and oak, ever recognize a home in this mud-spattered man learning to plant Chinese foxglove with blistered hands? It was a grim Thursday morning in November, and the wind sent dry leaves skittering across the glass doors of the law office. I sat on the front row in one of those hard-backed wooden chairs that dig into your spine after 10 minutes, wearing the only jacket I owned that still passed for respectable. The cuffs were frayed, but I'd pressed it the night before. Across the table sat my daughter, Erin, draped in a black cashmere coat that fell just so, and on her wrist a Patek Philippe that caught the fluorescent light in tiny, sharp splinters. She did not look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the documents Mr. Rowe was spreading across the mahogany, and her jaw was set tight. Mr. Rowe was an old man with silver hair and gold-rimmed glasses, and he read the will in a voice as flat and uninflected as a ruled line. His office was crammed with archival boxes, and outside the single window, a bare sycamore stretched its branches toward a sky the color of slate. The residential property at Oak Ridge, approximately 5,600 square feet of floor space on 2.3 acres of land, with a current market valuation of approximately $8,200,000, is bequeathed to the granddaughter, Erin McKay. Erin's fingers curled slightly against the armrest. She didn't turn her head, but I caught the faint shift in the downward arc of her lashes. Mr. Rowe turned a page. The farm at Mill Creek, comprising 117 acres with a main house, one barn, and several outbuildings, current market valuation, approximately $127,000, is bequeathed to the son, James McKay. $127,000. Not even a fraction of the mansion's worth. Behind me, someone drew in a sharp breath. Erin's husband, Mark, a private equity man with diamond cufflinks that winked every time he moved. He sat half a yard behind me, separated from Erin by one empty chair, the chair that had been left for me, though I hadn't taken it. From the moment we'd walked into that office, Erin had not once met my eye, and I had not tried to close the distance. 10 years of silence had built a wall higher than any chair could cross. I stared at the number, 127,000, for a long while. Mill Creek Farm. The last time I'd set foot there was 20 years ago, on the day my mother was buried. Half the roof tiles had fallen in by then, the porch planks groaned underfoot, and from the barn's crossbeam hung a chain of rusted iron that clinked and clattered against the wood whenever the wind blew. A sound like a mournful bell. The land itself, over 100 acres, was mostly sloped and poor, never yielding much of anything, and the creek that gave the place its name ran so shallow in summer that it sometimes dried to a trickle. Even my father, while he lived, called it the money pit. Yet he stayed there until the lung disease took him, and my mother stayed another 15 years after that, until she collapsed in the kitchen with half a ball of dough still clutched in her hand. They left the farm to me, and the morning after I buried her, I locked the door and drove back to the city, and I never looked back. That place meant nothing to me but a rusted chain and a lump of dough that would never be needed. Mr. Rowe read off a few small cash bequests and the disposition of several antique pieces. My mother had never accumulated much in the way of savings. The money in her checking account wouldn't have covered a decent funeral. What silenced the room was the fact that she had left nearly all her tangible wealth to Erin, a granddaughter she had seen fewer than 5 times. When it was over, I was the last to stand. Mr. Rowe handed me the farm's title documents in a manila envelope and patted my shoulder once, as if he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. I'd known him for 30 years, and he could probably see what I was feeling. Not calm, just numb. Erin stood by the corridor window, and Mark was murmuring to her in a low voice. I caught scraps. Get an appraiser on the parcel, maybe a zoning change. She didn't respond, just gazed out at the grey sky. I walked over and stopped about 2 paces away. Congratulations, Erin, I said, keeping my voice as level as I could. That house meant a great deal to your grandmother. She turned to look at me. 10 years had passed, and she was as tall as I was now. Her face carried echoes of her mother's youth, but overlaid with something sharp and distant I'd never seen before. She studied my face for a few seconds, her lips parting slightly, and finally she gave me only this. What are you going to do with the farm? I don't know yet. I'll go take a look. Look at what? There's nothing there. Her tone was mild, but that made it cut deeper than any sneer. You haven't been back in all these years. What's the point of going now? I looked at the white cuff of her shirt, showing just beneath her coat sleeve, and suddenly the woman before me felt both achingly familiar and utterly foreign. She was my daughter. I had held her in my arms on summer nights and pointed out constellations. She was also the girl I hadn't dared call for 7 straight years, because I was terrified of hearing her ask, Daddy, why don't you ever come see us? Your grandmother had her reasons for leaving you that house, I said, and she had her reasons for leaving me that farm. Erin said nothing more. She just gave a faint frown, then turned and took Mark's arm, walking toward the elevator. Her heels clicked on the marble floor, crisp, distant. I stayed where I was, watching the elevator doors slide shut, swallowing her expensive black coat into a slit of silver grey. The corridor fell silent. Just me, the manila envelope, and the dry leaves spiraling past the window. It took me 3 full days to work up the nerve to go to Mill Creek. The drive from the city took over 4 hours. I borrowed a friend's old pickup. My sedan sat too low for the back roads. Once I left the highway, the asphalt narrowed to 2 lanes, then to 1, and the trees thickened on either side until their bare branches wove together overhead like a net of grey wool. The sky stayed overcast the whole way, and a few crows skimmed low across the pavement. At a little town called Harlow, I turned off the main road onto a gravel track and followed it for another 20 minutes. A mailbox leaned crookedly in the weeds, its paint blistered down to the rusted metal underneath. When I killed the engine in front of the house, the silence that rushed in was so complete it felt like a physical weight. Mill Creek Farm was more dilapidated than I remembered. The roof of the main house had caved in across a wide section, as though someone had driven a fist straight through it. The porch planks had rotted through in several places, and a few hung suspended by nothing but splinters, swaying slightly. Some windows were broken, others were boarded up with plywood that had been tagged with graffiti I couldn't decipher, teenagers probably, passing through. The lock had rusted solid, and after struggling with the key for a minute, I had to put my shoulder to the door and force it open. Inside, though, it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. Perhaps 20 years of being sealed had put the house into a state of suspended animation. No weather, no animals, just dust settling in slow, deliberate layers over everything. In the fireplace lay a half-burned log, the last fire my father ever lit. On the dining table sat an enamel mug. The water inside had long since evaporated, leaving a brown ring of tea stain at the bottom. My mother's handwriting was still there. On the kitchen wall hung a small chalkboard, and on it, in her clear, slender script, with that characteristic little upward flick at the end of each downward stroke, was written, "Thursday, pickles, sew buttons, return ho to old Jung." When I saw that board, something caught in my throat. I reached up and took it down, turning it over, and on the back, in pencil, were more words. "Jamie's birthday next month. Save up to buy him that animal encyclopedia." That was 34 years ago. I couldn't remember whether I'd ever actually received the book, but my eyes burned all the same. I spent the afternoon making a rough survey of the house. The structure was sounder than I'd expected, no major cracks in the foundation, and the timber, though old, hadn't rotted. This place had been built 120 years ago by my grandfather's grandfather, using local hickory, and in those days, people built things to last for generations. The barn was in worse shape, the roof had completely collapsed, and inside lay a heap of decomposed hay and rusted implements, plus an abandoned stable whose wooden stalls were draped in cobwebs like funeral shrouds. I stood at the barn entrance and looked out over the slope, nearly 100 acres of winter fields, empty and mute. In the distance, a narrow ribbon of water caught the light. Mill Creek itself, shallower than I remembered but still flowing, its surface breaking the thin sun into shards of silver. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Erin, just one line. "Have you seen the house yet?" I stared at the screen for a long moment. In 10 years, this was one of only a handful of private exchanges between us. The last had been before her wedding, when she texted to tell me, "Don't bother coming, my mother will walk me down the aisle." I typed, deleted, retyped, and finally settled on 2 words. "Just got here." She didn't reply. I put the phone away and walked along the creek bank downstream. The slope was thick with dead grass and brambles, soft underfoot, and the earth smelled damp and vegetal, of things rotting back into the soil. A few old willows bent their branches over the water, swaying in the breeze. After another 10 minutes, at a bend in the creek, I came across a stone ruin, the remains of an old mill. Only half a wall still stood, but on one of the stones, nearly obscured by moss, words had been carved. I crouched down and scraped the moss away with my fingers. Beneath it, a line of ornate script emerged, worn but legible. This mill was built in 1873, the first mill of the Mackay family. May the day the millstone turns be the day the family flourishes. I sat down on that stone, and the wind swept through the valley, lifting dead leaves in spirals. A red-tailed hawk circled over the fields, and I thought, maybe my mother left me this broken farm because she believed, or hoped, that one day I would sit right here and see this very stone. I took a photo and sent it to Erin. She replied quickly, "What's that?" "Your great-great-grandfather's mill, 1873. You planning to keep those rocks as treasure?" "Maybe," I typed. "Maybe these stones are worth more than that $8 million mansion. You just need to know how to look at them." This time, Erin's silence stretched, So long that the sun began to sink, so long that I'd given up on a reply. Then my phone lit up again. "Since when did you get so sentimental?" I didn't answer. The clouds at the horizon had caught fire, turning the creek to flowing gold. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my trousers, and walked back toward the pickup. My boots crunched through the dead leaves, and the sound was sharp and clean in the open field. I planned to come back tomorrow, and the day after, and maybe for many days after that. I spent 5 days at the farm, sleeping at a shabby but clean motel in town, driving out to Mill Creek each morning and returning at dusk. I went through every room in the main house, bagging up my mother's clothes and keepsakes, things she'd never thrown away, things I couldn't bear to throw away either, but which were only gathering dust. I sorted them into plastic bins, labeled each one, and stacked them in the half of the barn that still had a roof. On the 5th evening, Mark called. His tone was more polite than it had been at the reading, but that politeness had a thin, brittle quality to it, like cellophane, clear to the eye but rough to the touch. "James," he said, "Erin asked me to call and see if you'd like to come have a look at the house," she said. He paused, choosing his words. "It was your mother's home for most of her life. There might be things—" I held the phone and stood at the north-facing window of my motel room for a long time. Outside, I could see the farm's boundary line, marked by a lone oak standing in the middle of a field like a black cutout. Why didn't she call me herself? A beat of silence on Mark's end. She was afraid you'd say no. "All right," I said. "I'll come tomorrow morning." The mansion was in Oak Ridge, a 3-hour drive in the opposite direction from Mill Creek. My mother's life had spanned that entire distance, from the broken-down farmhouse on the eastern edge to the grand stone manor on the western ridge, with a gulf in between that I'd never fully understood. She'd lived at Mill Creek until she was 40, then moved to Oak Ridge, and somewhere along that road lay a divide I had never crossed. When I followed the GPS up the private driveway to Oak Ridge the next day, the moment the house came into view, I understood why Erin had reached out. It was a Victorian stone mansion, 3 stories of red brick and grey slate, with 4 white columns supporting the front porch. The grounds were immaculate, clipped yews, a towering oak, the namesake of the ridge, and fresh paint on every window frame. The lawn was manicured, the brick driveway swept clean, and black iron gates stood open at the entrance. I stopped the car and didn't get out right away. Through the windshield, I saw Erin standing at a second-floor window, a cup in her hands. She'd seen me arrive, but she didn't come down to greet me, just stood there, watching through the glass, like she was looking at something she hadn't yet decided how to handle. Mark came out instead, his suit swapped for a casual cardigan, his smile practiced and pleasant. "James, come in. Erin's upstairs. She'll be down in a minute." The living room was larger than I'd imagined, with a real fireplace crackling at one end, the flames casting a warm orange glow over everything. Oil paintings hung on the walls, and I recognized one immediately, a portrait of my mother, wearing a deep green velvet dress, seated in an armchair, her posture poised, her gaze serene, a faint smile curving the corner of her mouth. She looked younger in the painting than I remembered, and also more distant. I stood before that portrait for a long time. I didn't notice when Erin came down the stairs. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Her voice came from 2 paces behind me, neither warm nor cold. She never told me she'd had a portrait done. She never told me either. Erin stepped up beside me, shoulder to shoulder with the frame. I found it when I was going through her things. It was in the 3rd-floor hallway, covered with a white sheet. When I pulled it off, I thought I was seeing a ghost. You know what she was like in my memory? A grey-haired old woman in an apron, kneading dough in the kitchen. But this woman in the painting... Like a completely different person, I finished for her. Yes. Erin glanced at me, and the look in her eyes was complicated. I couldn't read it all, but I saw the faint tremor in her lashes. A year before she died, she asked me to come stay with her for a week. Every day, she made me sit with her by that fireplace and tell her stories about my life. But she never mentioned you, not once. I shoved my hands into my pockets and gripped my car keys so hard the ridges bit into my palm. She had every right not to mention me. Erin didn't respond. She led me through the living room, the dining room, the study, each one tastefully appointed, bearing the marks of a comfortable later life: expensive watercolors, leather-bound books, Persian rugs, brass doorknobs. Any one of these objects could have funded a year's worth of renovations on the farm. But as I walked through those rooms, I felt nothing. I didn't recognize this woman, the one who'd lived at Oak Ridge. The mother I remembered wore a blue and white checked apron, chalk dust on her fingers, shelling peas on the porch, and looking up when I came home from school, her eyes crinkling into crescents. That mother and this house's mistress felt like two different people who happened to share a name. When we reached the second floor, Erin pushed open a door. "Your room." I blinked. The room was modest, south-facing, with windows that overlooked the lawn and the hills beyond. On the nightstand sat an old photograph in a silver frame, me at 7 or 8, crouching in the farmyard, coaxing an orange tabby, while my mother leaned against the doorframe behind me, watching with a smile. The photo had yellowed and curled at the edges, but she'd kept it in that silver frame all these years. "She told me this room was always kept for you." Erin's voice came from the doorway. "For 30 years, she changed the sheets every few months, aired the quilt. I asked her why, and she said she didn't want you to be uncomfortable if you ever came back." I stood in front of that photograph, and the knot that had been lodged in my throat for 3 days finally shattered. My back was to Erin, my shoulders didn't move, but something was falling behind my eyes. "You never did come back," Erin said. "No." "Not once?" "Not once." She pulled the door, softly shut. I heard her footsteps retreat down the hallway, growing fainter until the crackle of the fireplace downstairs swallowed them. I picked up the frame and turned it over. On the back of the silver base, a yellowed sticky note bore my mother's handwriting. Jamie's favorite cat, Mimi, only 3 months old that year. Jamie made her a little nest of grass. My fingers tightened on the frame's edge until the metal pressed hard into my palm. I didn't let go. That evening, Erin served dinner. She'd roasted a chicken and made mashed potatoes from scratch. Mark opened a bottle of red wine, and we talked about harmless things: property taxes, their travel plans for next year, cases at her firm. I ate quietly and answered when spoken to. The atmosphere at the table was cordial enough, but it felt like thin ice over deep water. None of us knew how far down it went. Then, near the end of the meal, Erin set down her fork and knife and looked at me. Her voice had dropped several degrees. "Dad, Grandma didn't leave me this house because I was closest to her." I looked up. "She left it to me because she was afraid you'd sell it." Erin's gaze was steady. "She said if she left it to you, you'd liquidate it and disappear for good. She didn't want you to disappear. She wanted you to have at least one place you might feel you could come back to." Silence settled over the table for a full 10 seconds. A log in the fireplace split with a loud crack, sending up a spray of sparks. "The last thing she said to me," Erin went on, dropping her gaze to her napkin, folding a corner and unfolding it again. "I gave him the key to the farm. He'll understand." She raised her eyes to mine. "But did you?" I looked at my daughter's face, that face so much like her mother's, and I saw something in it I'd never seen before. a look that was half question and half waiting. I opened my mouth, and 100 things rose in my chest, each one jamming in my throat. In the end, I said only, "I'm going back to Mill Creek tomorrow." "I knew you would." Erin lifted her wine glass and took a sip. "I knew it the day you sent me that photo of the stone." That night, I slept in the room my mother had kept ready for 30 years. The sheets were clean and smelled faintly of lavender. The quilt was plump and warm. Outside, Oak Ridge lay quiet under the winter dark, and far away, lights glimmered in other houses like scattered diamonds on black velvet. I lay in that unfamiliar room, staring at the ceiling, and remembered things I'd tried not to remember for decades. My mother humming in the kitchen, the rain on the day my father died, the sweat in my palms as I waited outside the delivery room when Erin was born. And the last time I'd seen my mother, standing at the Mill Creek farmhouse door, half a ball of dough in her hand, saying, "Jamie, if you ever want to come back, the key's under the doormat." She hadn't said, "Come home." She'd said, "Come back." I closed my eyes and turned my face into the pillow. The lavender scent clung to it, faint and clean, mingling in my imagination with the smell of flour and wood ash that had always clung to her hands. At 3 a.m, I woke. The moon silvered the room, casting everything in half light. I pulled on my jacket and went downstairs, stood before the portrait in the living room. Moonlight slanted through the tall windows, falling across my mother's painted face, and she looked back at me with that subtle smile. Softer now, more tender in the dimness. "Mum," I whispered, "you left me that broken farm because you wanted me to bring it back to life, didn't you?" The painted woman gave no answer. She just kept smiling, as she had in life, holding all the words she'd never said in a lump of dough that would never be needed. The second week after Oak Ridge, I began working the Mill Creek farm in earnest. I hired an old carpenter from town, Mr. Wood, a man in his 70s with hands still steady as a vice and an eye so precise he could drive a nail straight without a level. He brought 2 younger helpers, and over 6 days they re-braced the collapsed section of roof, replaced the rotted rafters and shingles, and reinforced every window frame. On the final evening, Mr. Wood stood at the barn door, smoking his pipe and squinting across the slope. "Jamie," he said, "this land's not as poor as it looks. Dig down 2 feet and you'll hit good black soil. It's just been left fallow too long. The weeds have sucked the life out of the top layer." 2 feet? I stared at the 100 acres of rolling hills. Digging 2 feet down across all of that would take a lifetime. Mr. Wood tapped ash from his pipe. "You think your mother held on to this place for nothing? Your great-grandfather did something back in the day. He diverted water from Mill Creek and built an irrigation channel across this slope. It's been filled in for 70 years, but the stonework's still there if you know where to look. Clear that channel, get the water flowing again, and you can grow just about anything on this ground." I was stunned. I'd been in and out of this farm my whole life and never known there was an irrigation system. Mr. Wood led me along the slope, kicking aside layers of dead leaves and topsoil, until, in several places, the edges of blue-grey stone appeared, neatly laid rubble, the channel walls, mostly buried but still intact. The line of it followed the contour of the hill all the way down to the creek bank. I crouched and scraped at the stones with my fingers. Between them, I could still see the dried remnants of mortar, laid with painstaking care. "Who built it?" I asked. "Your great-grandfather and his 4 sons worked on it a whole winter." Mr. Wood pointed his pipe toward the creek. "There's a pump house down there too, collapsed by now, but the cast iron pipes are still in the ground. If you're willing to put in the work, you could hook up a pump and push water all the way to the top of the slope." I stayed crouched on that slope for a long time. The winter sun hung low on the horizon, casting a grey-blue sheen over the old stones, half hidden in the earth. I thought again of the chalkboard in the kitchen. Return ho to old Jung, not an accounting of debts, but a record of obligations. My mother never let a single thing slide. That afternoon, I rented a small excavator and began to dig along the line Mr. Wood had shown me. 3 days later, we'd uncovered nearly 200 yards of the old channel, collapsed in places, but its overall path and structure intact. The bed was lined with gravel, the walls were cut from uniform blue stone, and at several bends we found branching sluices designed to divert water to different sections of the field. For a project 100 years old, it was nothing short of monumental. On the 4th day, as I was clearing the section of channel nearest the barn, the excavator bucket struck something hard and metallic with a dull clang. I jumped down and scraped away the dirt by hand until I uncovered an iron box, about 18 inches long, crusted with rust but still intact. A small padlock, equally rusted, held the lid shut. I pried it open with a crowbar, and the lock shattered into pieces. When I lifted the lid, the scent of mothballs and old paper rose in a sharp, nostalgic cloud. Inside, neatly arranged, were a stack of notebooks wrapped in oilcloth, several letters tied with string, and a small velvet pouch. I opened the pouch and found a silver pocket watch, its lid engraved. To my eldest son James, from his father, 1952. My father's watch. He died when I was 10, never having the chance to give it to me himself. I didn't read the letters or notebooks right away. I carried the box to the main house, set it on the dining table, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window, drinking it slowly. Then I poured a second glass and sat down. My fingers trembled slightly as I touched the string around the topmost letter. It was from my mother to my father. The handwriting was slim and precise, with that characteristic upward flick at the end of each stroke. The date was the autumn of 1963, the year I was born. Henry, it began, Atada. Today, I took Jamie up to the channel. He doesn't know the way yet, but he kept staring at the water. He has your eyes, Henry, exactly your eyes. You know what your grandfather always said? The day the millstone turns is the day the family flourishes. I had it carved into the millstone, not just for decoration, but so our children would know where they came from. Jamie is small now, but one day he'll understand. Just as you taught me, the land never fails anyone willing to bend their back. I held that letter in my hands for a long time at the table. Outside, darkness had fallen. The barn was only a vague shadow in the night. The pocket watch grew warm in my palm, absorbing my body heat, and for a moment it felt as though my father were holding my hand through the decades. That night, I didn't go back to the motel. I slept in the farmhouse living room, building a fire in the hearth from firewood Mr. Wood had salvaged from the old pile, seasoned for 20 years, catching flame at the first spark, burning bright and steady. I brought the iron box to the fireside and began to read, one notebook after another. They were my mother's journals, spanning more than 30 years. From the second year of her marriage onward, she had filled one notebook each year, in pencil or pen, with dense, meticulous entries. The early ones were mostly farming records, planting dates, harvest yields, weather patterns, livestock births. She kept accounts in the same steady hand as my father, every line noted, and a horizontal stroke drawn beneath each total, as though she wanted every task properly closed. But as the years went on, the entries changed. The farming notes grew sparser, replaced by short reflections, sometimes only a line or two, jotted down as if they'd just come to her. April 1990. Jamie climbed up onto the barn beam today. I swatted his hand. He cried, then came back and asked, "Mum, will you teach me the words on the millstone?" I did. He stood in front of the stone and read it 3 times, then looked up and said, "Mum, I want to make the mill turn too." Est. November 1995. Henry is gone. His last words were, "Fix the millstone. Where there's water, there's a way." I promised him I would, but I haven't done it yet. Jamie came home from the city for the funeral. He was thinner, unshaven. I barely recognized him. He stood at the barn door for a long time, but he never walked in. Before he left, he said, "Mum, you should come live with me in the city." I told him I wouldn't. He didn't argue. January 1996. Jamie got married. I wasn't there. He didn't ask me. I think he believed I disapproved. But it wasn't that. I was afraid that if I went, I'd never have the strength to come back to Mill Creek. Summer 2000. Erin was born. I heard it from one of Jamie's old school friends. I wanted to go, but I was afraid. I hadn't seen him in so long. I didn't know what kind of mother I'd be, showing up out of nowhere. That night I sat by the channel and worked on the old millstone with a file until midnight. I scraped the dirt out of the grooves, as if I could scrape the blockage out of my own heart. But it wouldn't come clean. I turned the pages faster and faster, the paper edges curling in the firelight. Each page spoke to me. All the loneliness, the longing, the regret, the hope my mother had carried alone on Mill Creek for 2 decades. She had poured it all into these notebooks. The letters she never mailed, the words she never said out loud, all of it was here. Near the end of the second-to-last notebook, she'd written this, a year before she died. "I've decided to leave Oak Ridge to Erin. She doesn't need money, but she needs a definition of home. Jamie gave her life, but he was absent for most of her childhood. I'm not blaming my son, I'm trying to give what he couldn't. The house, the painting, all those things, they'll tell her she was loved. As for Mill Creek, I'm leaving it to Jamie. I know he'll come back. He was always bonded to the land. He thinks he walked away, but the soil never really washed off his shoes. The channel is still waiting for him, and the millstone is still waiting. One day, the mill will turn again, and he'll stand in front of that carved stone and understand. There are things worth more than money." The last page contained only a date and one final sentence, written a week before her death. The characters were crooked, the strokes broken, as if her hand had lost its strength. "Jamie, the key is under the doormat. Asda." I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the wind moaned through the gaps in the barn wall, a low, keening sound. I curled up on the sofa with that notebook hugged against me, and the tears finally broke loose, tracking down my face and soaking the cover. I remembered when I was small, standing on my toes at the mill ruin, and my mother bending. I shook my head. I was too young for the answer. She pulled her coat tighter and looked down at me. Her eyes held both starlight and frost. "Because a person needs a place where they can bend their back." I held the notebook in the firelight through the whole night. It wasn't until dawn crept through the windows, laying a cold white stripe across the dusty floor, that I finally rose, put the notebook back in the iron box, and closed the lid. Then I pushed open the farmhouse door and walked out into the December cold. A thin rime of frost glazed the barn roof, and the fields lay in a pale, silent grey. I walked the length of the channel we'd uncovered, running my fingers along the edges of the blue stones, rough, cold, and carrying across 100 years the same dogged certainty. I pulled out my phone and sent Erin a message. "The channel is here. The millstone is here too. Your grandmother left everything behind. I just never bent down to look." Her reply came fast. "So you're bending down now?" "Digging deeper," I typed. "Maybe I'll dig up something valuable." "More valuable than 8 million?" I looked out across the slope that rolled to the foot of the hills, and then to the distant creek, a thread of silver under the winter sun. The glow of the phone screen lit my face, and I could almost picture the lift of her eyebrow as she typed her question. I sent back one final line. A lot more valuable than 8 million. I began work on the irrigation channel in earnest by mid-December. Mr. Wood found me 2 young helpers from the neighboring villages, quiet boys with strong shoulders and few words. We tore out the most collapsed sections of the channel wall and rebuilt them, fitting each stone to the pattern of the old ones, leveling and mortaring by hand. Where we ran short of the original blue stone, we gathered river cobbles from the creek bank to patch the gaps. The patchwork was obvious, but alongside the old foundation, it held together. The hardest part was the dredging. The channel had been clogged with silt and rubble for nearly 70 years, and in some stretches it had entirely disappeared, requiring us to dig out its shape inch by inch with shovels and picks. After 3 days, my lower back screamed every time I moved, and my palms had blistered and burst and calloused over in layers. But every few yards of cleared channel felt different, like performing bypass surgery on a vein that had been asleep for generations, waking it, section by section, back to life. One evening, as Mr. Wood stood by the channel, smoking his pipe, he observed, "Jamie, your mother would have laughed herself silly if she could see you kneeling here in the mud." I looked up, a smear of clay across my cheek. Why would she laugh? She'd laugh because she'd be happy. You finally bent your back. He gestured with his pipe toward the slope. Your great-grandfather built this channel before your mother was born. But she married into this place, and within 2 years she knew every inch of its history. She told me once, Mill Creek has its name from our ancestors, but that millstone hasn't turned in nearly 80 years. I may never see it turn, but I can clear the way for the ones who come after. I crouched in the ditch, my trowel paused mid-scoop. Ice-cold water from the channel wall had soaked through my gloves, numbing my fingers, but the cold had a strange clarity to it. She cleared the way, I said quietly. I just never got on the road. That night, back at the farmhouse, I mopped the living room floor, stoked the fire, and boiled a pot of noodles with a poached egg. As I sat alone at the table, my phone rang, a video call from Erin. I stared at it for a few seconds before answering. When her face appeared on the screen, I saw her apartment's floor-to-ceiling windows behind her, the city lights outside like a river of gold in the distance. "You're eating noodles?" She glanced at my bowl, her voice carrying an odd, ambivalent note. "Looks plain." "Hard day, too tired to cook." "Are you at a construction site?" She'd noticed the exposed rafters behind me, the old wallpaper peeling in strips. "I'm at Mill Creek. I'm repairing the irrigation channel." She was silent for a few heartbeats. Then, "I'm coming tomorrow." Now it was my turn to be silent. I watched her face on the screen as she turned her gaze away, toward the city lights beyond her window, speaking as if to herself. "I've been thinking a lot about why I've always been afraid to see you. It's not because you did anything terrible. It's because every time I see you, I remember those afternoons when I was little, standing at the front door, waiting for someone who never came. Waiting for someone who wouldn't show up." She stopped and took a breath, audible even through the speaker. "I don't want to wait anymore. I'm going to come and see for myself." She arrived the next afternoon, driving herself in an understated white sedan. When she pulled up in front of the farmhouse, gravel spattered against the porch steps. She wore a camel-colored down jacket and jeans, with a pair of old boots that looked like they'd been dug out of the back of her closet. A woman who usually presented herself with such precision, she'd only wear those boots if she'd braced herself to get her hands dirty. I took her to see the channel. The sun was setting, turning the whole length of the stone channel into a line of pale gold, winding down the slope like a dormant spine. The newly patched sections were a lighter shade, but they already seemed to be settling in beside the old. Erin crouched by the channel and touched the fresh stonework with her fingertips. "You laid this yourself?" "Mr. Wood taught me. I mixed the mortar and carried the stones. He did the leveling and the finishing lines." She straightened and let her gaze travel up the channel's course, then down along the slope, finally resting on the bare fields in the distance. A winter breeze lifted the loose hair at her temples, and she didn't push it away, just stood there, backlit, like a figure in a painting. "What are you going to grow here?" she asked. "First, finish the channel and install the pump. Then, turn the soil in the spring. Mr. Wood says there's good black earth underneath, good for fruit trees or medicinal herbs." "Herbs?" "Yes. The slope drains well and gets plenty of sun. Things like polygonatum and bletilla, they're worth more than grain per acre. I looked into the climate and soil. They do well here." She looked at me then, and I took a while to read the expression in her eyes. It was surprise, or perhaps a recalibration. In her memory, I was probably still the blurry silhouette of a father who couldn't make it back, a vague excuse from her childhood. But in front of her now stood a middle-aged man, kneeling in a ditch, mixing cement and researching herbal plantings, with mud streaked across his face. "You've changed a lot," she said. "Maybe." I scuffed at the soil beside the channel with my boot. "Or maybe you just never had the chance to see me like this before." She didn't argue. I took her to the barn and then to the mill ruin. When we reached the carved stone, she pulled out her phone and photographed it, then crouched and traced the lettering with one finger. "This mill was built in 1873. She read it aloud, her voice softer than the wind. "Your grandmother stood right here, the year I was born," I said. "She told me, a person needs a place where they can bend their back." I didn't understand it then. "Do you understand it now?" I watched her profile as she crouched by the stone. The setting sun laid a thin layer of gold dust on her shoulder. "I understand it now. She left me this broken farm because it was the place she wanted me to learn to bend. She forced me to come back, to get my hands in the dirt and the stones, to sweat into this soil and bring it back to life. She wasn't dividing assets, she was planting me back into the ground so I could grow again." Erin stood and brushed the dirt off her knees. Her eyes were faintly red-rimmed, but the corner of her mouth turned upward. "She told me you kept the key under the doormat, but you never bent down to pick it up." I stepped forward, the stone between us, and faced her. A decade of silence and hundreds of miles of misunderstanding had stood between us, but at that moment, the distance felt thinner than a piece of blue stone. "The key was always there," I said. "I've bent down now." She nodded, and a tear slipped free. She wiped it away quickly with her sleeve, then turned and walked toward the farmhouse. A few steps on, she stopped and looked back. "Tomorrow, I'm going to work with you. Mixing mortar, carrying stones. I can do it." "Can you?" "No, but you can teach me." She paused, and her voice dropped. "Like Grandma taught you to read the words on the stone." That night, I made a simple dinner, beef stew with potatoes and a pot of mixed grains. Erin ate more than I'd expected, going back for seconds, even using a piece of bread to mop up the last of the gravy from her bowl. When she finally set down her fork, she looked at me and said, "Dad, I want to donate the Oak Ridge house." I put down my fork. "What?" "For public use. A children's reading centre or a rural art space. I don't want to live there. It's too big, too empty. Mark agrees." She leaned back in her chair. "Grandma didn't leave it to me so I could lock the doors and let it gather dust. She left it so I could pass something on. Since I can't be like her and hold a farm together, I'll carry her spirit forward in a different way. I looked at her, the firelight playing across her face, and I saw something that startled me. A stillness, a certainty that reminded me of my mother's expression in that portrait. "Your grandmother would be proud," I said. "I know," she smiled, and the smile carried a glint of tears, but was luminous all the same. "So I'd better learn how to mix mortar right tomorrow. Grandma left you something to carry on, and she left me something too. Neither of us should let her down." Outside, the wind stirred, and the old chain under the barn eaves clinked, a sound like a rusty bell. I sat at the table across from this woman with the same eyes as mine, and felt the weight that had pressed on me for 10 years begin, slowly, to dissolve. The irrigation channel was completed a week before the Lunar New Year. On the evening Mr. Wood and his helpers finished, I hooked up the refurbished pump and threw the switch. The old cast-iron pump coughed and groaned like a rusty throat, and then the water came, muddy and iron-tasting at first, surging along the cleared stone channel, swirling at the first bend, then flowing down the slope, clearer and brighter with every yard. I stood by the channel and watched the water traverse the whole field, taking nearly 2 full minutes to reach the final holding basin at the far end. One of Mr. Wood's helpers shouted from the distance, "It's here!" His voice bouncing across the empty field, thinned and scattered by the wind. Erin filmed the whole thing on her phone. She crouched by the channel, tracking the flow with her camera until the water reached the end, then stood and said into the lens, "Grandma, the water's here." That evening, Erin and I sat together by the farmhouse hearth. She opened one of the notebooks and read my mother's words aloud. "Jamie will come back one day. The channel is still waiting for him, and the millstone is still waiting. The mill will turn again, and he will stand before the carved stone and understand. There are things worth more than money." She closed the notebook and looked at me. "You're standing in front of that stone now, so what's more valuable than money?" I thought about it for a long time. The firelight illuminated both our faces, and our shadows stretched across the wall, one tall, one shorter, like 2 trees. "Someone who was willing to build a channel for you," I said, "and then wait decades for you to come back and see it." Erin didn't answer with words. Instead, she leaned over and rested her head on my shoulder. It was a gesture she'd done 100 times as a child. On weekend afternoons, curled up on the sofa watching cartoons, she'd drift off against my shoulder without thinking. Back then, her hair smelled of strawberry shampoo, soft and fluffy like a kitten's. I used to think I'd always have that shoulder for her to lean on. "Dad," she said, her voice muffled. "Yeah?" "In Grandma's letter," she said, "the day the millstone turns is the day the family flourishes. What if it never turned?" "Then it would never turn." I smoothed her hair. It was straighter now, different from the old days, but the little crown of a cowlick at the top, that same spiral, was still there, like the center ring of a tree. "But it's already turning. The water's here. The mill will move. The rest is just time." She didn't reply, but I felt her shoulders tremble slightly. I stirred the fire with a poker, and the flames leaped up, casting dancing warmth across the stone walls. Outside, the wind blew hard. Inside, it was a different world. On the 2nd day of the new year, I returned to the mill ruin, this time with a shovel and gloves, determined to clear the weeds and debris from around the remaining wall. Erin came with me, wearing an old straw hat I'd dug out for her, crouching beside the stones and pulling dry vines by hand. As I cleared the corner of the ruin, my shovel struck something hard again. Not another iron box this time. A larger slab of blue stone, half buried, its surface inscribed with dense text. I scraped off the soil and moss and uncovered an intact stela, older and more detailed than the carving on the mill wall. The title read, Record of the Mackay Mill, with a date corresponding to 1873. Nearly 400 characters in classical Chinese script, detailing the construction of the mill, the planning of the irrigation channel, and the expectations of the first generation for their descendants. I crouched before the stela and read it aloud, character by character, while Erin listened beside me, occasionally asking about a rare word. The winter sun slanted through the clouds, striking the stone surface, and those words, buried for more than a century, seemed to come alive in the light. The final passage read, "I built this mill not to accumulate 10,000 taels of gold for my children, but to preserve a root of diligence. The land yields grain, and it yields resolve. Water turns the millstone, and it turns the heart. Future generations, if you see this stone, know the hardship with which your forebears moved mountains and brought water here. Do not dismiss small tasks, and do not abandon thin profits. As long as the millstone does not cease to turn, the family will not decline." Erin crouched on the other side of the stela, tracing the characters with one finger. She stopped at the phrase, "preserve a root of diligence," looked up, and met my eyes. Hers were glistening. "Dad," she said, her voice a little rough, "Grandma chose the right person." I crouched across from her, the stela between us, like a river of time. "She chose the right person for you too," I said. "When you gave away that big house, you were moving mountains and bringing water, just in a different way. What we're doing is different, but the root is the same." That afternoon, we went back to the farmhouse and carried the old millstone out of the barn. It was granite, about 30 inches in diameter, and astonishingly heavy. It took me, Erin, and Mr. Wood together just to tilt it upright and wash the mud and moss off its surface. The grinding grooves were remarkably well preserved. The granite's grain swirled in rings like the growth lines of an ancient tree. "Once the mill is rebuilt, we'll put this stone back in place," I said. Erin ran her fingers along a faintly carved character on the rim, the character for Lynn, her great-grandfather's surname. "What will we grind first?" "Cornmeal to start." I patted the surface of the stone. "Then we'll see. The water's here anyway, might as well let it work." She laughed. The sound was scattered by the winter wind across the empty yard, but I knew it was real, alive, rising from somewhere deep in her chest. How long had it been since I'd heard her laugh like that? The last time might have been when she was 6, when I lifted her onto my shoulders to reach a pear on a high branch, and she laughed and kicked her little red sneakers against my chest. I stood in the yard, watching her. She crouched beside the millstone, tracing the carved character, and the wind lifted the hood of her jacket, exposing a small strip of skin at the nape of her neck. Her complexion was a shade deeper than her mother's, like mine, but the line of her shoulders echoed her grandmother's. "Erin," I called. She looked up. "You asked earlier what the day the millstone turns is the day the family flourishes meant," I said. "I've been thinking about it. It doesn't mean money or houses. It means someone works, someone stays, someone waits. All three together, and the millstone turns." She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and walked toward me. We stood side by side in front of that old granite stone, watching the last streak of sunset dissolve into the horizon. The iron chain under the barn eaves clinked again, this time not mournful, but like someone ringing a bell in the near distance. "My dad was right," she said, very softly. "A lot more valuable than 8 million. When spring came, everything changed. I ploughed the slope with a tractor, turned in lime to amend the soil, and bought several hundred polygonatum seedlings from the county agricultural station. Erin came every weekend, graduating from learning to mix mortar to learning to farm. Soon her hands were calloused, and permanent crescents of soil lodged under her fingernails. but she didn't seem to care. One afternoon, crouched in a furrow, pushing seedlings into the earth, she looked up and said, "I think I finally understand what a place where you can bend your back means." "What does it feel like?" I asked from the other end of the row. She thought for a moment. "Like playing in mud when you're a kid. Dirty, but solid." Mark visited once, his trouser legs rolled to his knees, standing at the edge of the field, watching us plant. His expression hovered between bemusement and admiration. Before he left, he pulled me aside and said, "You've turned her into a different person. She used to sit in her office negotiating with clients. Now she's negotiating with a polygonatum sprout." I loaded the seed trays onto a cart and didn't respond, but I couldn't quite suppress the smile. Work also began at Oak Ridge. Erin had contacted a local cultural foundation and arranged to convert the mansion into a community reading centre and craft workshop, children's reading rooms on the ground floor, an adult reference library on the second, a small exhibition space on the third. On the first day of construction, she sent me a video of workers converting the living room into a wall of bookshelves. My mother's portrait had been moved to the end of the second-floor hallway, facing the top of the stairs, so that everyone who came up would see her. "I hung her here," Erin texted, "so everyone can see her. She wasn't waiting for one person to come back. She was telling everyone that there's a place for them." I watched the video several times and sent back a single word: good. The mill's restoration began in early April. Mr. Wood's grandson-in-law, a young structural engineer, took on the project. He reinforced the old half-wall with modern methods, rebuilt the other 3 walls and the roof, and installed a solid base for the millstone. The spring rains came late that year, not arriving until the last week of April. After that first downpour, Mill Creek swelled, and clear water rushed through the newly repaired channel, climbing all the way to the holding basin at the top of the slope, then seeping down through the furrows and into the earth around the polygonatum seedlings. That evening, I, Erin, Mr. Wood, and several neighbours from town gathered to carry the cleaned millstone into the rebuilt mill house and mount it on its base. As the last bolt was tightened, Mr. Wood's son, a man in his 40s, rigged a temporary water pipe, directing the flow through a wooden trough to the paddle wheel above the stone. The old granite let out a low, hesitant grinding sound, then slowly began to turn, one revolution, then another. It wasn't a dramatic noise, just the dull, continuous rumble of stone against stone, like the earth breathing from deep underground. The first fine stream of white cornmeal sifted through the grooves and collected in the trough below, like an early snowfall. Erin crouched beside the turning stone, pinched a little of the flour between her fingers, and touched it to her tongue. When she stood, the expression on her face was neither laughter nor tears, it was both. 150 years, she said. It's turning again. I stood in the mill house doorway, watching the stone rotate, one circle after another, powered by the flowing water. The sound of water and stone blended into a low, sustained hum. The sunset had turned the whole valley a soft orange-red, and the polygonatum seedlings were pushing up their first green shoots. Wind swept down from the slope, carrying the smell of moist earth and that deep, freshly turned scent that had been waiting for more than a century. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, a new message from Erin. She was standing 3 yards away, but she'd chosen to text me anyway. It read, "Dad, thank you for finally bending down." I looked up. She was standing beside the turning millstone, watching me, the sunset warming her face, a tiny streak of white flour caught in the fine lines at the corner of her eye. She lifted her phone and waved it slightly, urging me to respond. I typed, "You're welcome, and thank you for being willing to crouch down beside me." She read it, tucked her phone into her pocket, and walked up to me. She tilted her head back to look at me, and the light in her eyes was the same light I'd seen decades earlier, when she'd pedaled her bike up to the house, out of breath, beaming with pride after learning to ride. Then she opened her arms and hugged me. I was stunned for a moment. Then I lifted my own arms and folded them around her. The top of her head came just to my chin, her hair brushed against my jaw, carrying a clean, open-air scent, as if it had been washed by the wind off the fields. I tightened my arms and felt the shape of her shoulder blades beneath my hands. She was a grown woman now, but in my embrace, she was still the little girl who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on the sofa. When the millstone started turning, she murmured against my chest, "Grandma must have seen it from heaven." "She could always see," I said, resting my chin on the crown of her head. "She was just waiting for today." The millstone kept turning behind us, the water sluicing, the stone grinding, steady and continuous. The old iron chain beneath the barn eaves was gone. Erin had replaced it with a brass wind chime, and whenever the breeze blew, it made a light, clear sound, like the nursery rhyme I used to hum to her when she was small. 117 acres of sloping land, with a 70-year-old buried channel beneath its black soil, and a millstone that hadn't turned in 150 years. My mother had spent half her life hiding them in the ground, waiting for someone to come and dig them up. And someone did, not just me, but Erin and me together. That spring came earlier than usual. The night the millstone turned, I dreamed my mother was standing in the mill house doorway, wearing her blue and white checked apron, dusted with flour. She smiled at me, then turned and walked along the irrigation channel up the slope, growing smaller and smaller until she was just a blue and white speck, melting into the greening fields. When I woke, morning light was already filling the room. The creek was flowing, the millstone was turning, and Erin was baking bread in the yard. The smell drifted in through the door cracks. I sat up and saw the pocket watch and a half-eaten slice of bread on the nightstand, with a small note from Erin beside them, in her handwriting. "Dad, I put the animal encyclopedia on your desk. The old one in your study was falling apart, so I bought you a new copy. Take your time reading it." I turned the note over. On the back, in smaller letters, Grandma had a receipt tucked in her notebook from 1990. It said, "Animal Encyclopedia for Jamie, $8. She bought it. You never took it. I took it for you. It's 35 years late, but now it's on your desk." I held that note in the morning light for a long time. The sound of the millstone drifted from the valley, ancient, breathing, steady. I got up, dressed, and walked out the door. The yard was quiet. The brass wind chime rang softly in the breeze, and the freshly turned earth in the fields gleamed a deep, moist brown under the sun, like a book just opened. I looked toward the mill. The stone was still turning, its rhythm steady, as if it had always been that way, as if the road that began in 1873 had led all the way to this morning. I folded the note into my pocket and walked out to the field. The soil was soft and gave slightly under my feet. When I bent down, I saw the tiny green tips of the polygonatum seedlings rising through the earth, pale and delicate, like rows of characters learning to stand. I read that animal encyclopedia later. Tucked inside the front cover was a yellowed bookmark with a note in pencil. "Jamie, the book is here. Just a little late. When you've finished it, I'll have made you some dumplings." There was no signature, but the upward flick at the end of each stroke, I'd recognize it anywhere. The millstone kept turning. Spring wind carried through the valley, ringing the brass chime. I slipped the bookmark back to its page, closed the book, and crouched down to get back to work. The inscription on the steeler had said it well: "The land yields grain, and it yields resolve." Water turns the millstone, and it turns the heart. And I had spent 35 years learning to bend down and receive what had been waiting for me. But it wasn't too late. In the distance, Erin called out, "Dad, breakfast!" Her voice carried from the farmhouse door, scattered by the wind, warm and bright. I straightened up, pulled off my gloves, and walked toward her. That autumn, we harvested the polygonatum for the first time, and the yield exceeded my expectations. The agricultural station said the soil improvement had succeeded, and the next planting could be expanded. Erin drafted a report for the local cooperative, standardizing the cultivation process and sharing it with other farmers in the county who had similar sloping land. The mill opened to the public on weekends. Families came from town to watch the stone grind corn, and Erin organized children's activities at the Oak Ridge Center, letting kids pour kernels into the hopper and watch the white flour stream from the stone's crevices. Their eyes lit up like stars. She sent me a photo with a caption, "You were right, it's the same root." On the day the Oak Ridge Reading Center formally opened, Erin didn't ask me to come. She said, "When you come, I'll give you the tour myself." But the next day, she drove over with a stack of old picture books from a library clearance to put on the mill house's reading shelf for visiting children. She set the books on the windowsill, looked back at the turning millstone, then out at the green slope, and brushed the dust from her hands. "Dad," she said, "I feel incredibly rich right now." "How rich?" I leaned against the mill house door. "Richer than 8 million. She walked over and stood beside me, facing the fields with me. 8 million can be spent and vanish, but this— she swept her arm in a wide arc, taking in the farm, the mill, the creek, the slope, the distant silhouette of Oak Ridge. "This will keep going, as long as someone keeps bending down."